So this paper is on the decline of apprenticeship. Here we're trying to think about why apprenticeship declined and when it declined. We don't actually know when it declined in the North American context. We know if we look at the late 19th century, census records tell us that fewer boys were engaged in apprenticeships compared to earlier in the century. We don't know when that decline occurred, and we don't know why. It could be that formal schooling changed the way people were trained in various trades, or it could be something, a hypothesis that Golden and Sokoloff put forward, that the decline in apprenticeship had something to do with the way the fact that the nature of manufacturing changed, that instead of producing goods using primarily skilled labor, master craftsmen making an entire object from start to finish, employers and masters chose instead to use a lot more unskilled labor, and they divided up the tasks. So instead of building a whole shoe, somebody would do the cutting, somebody would do the sewing, and all of those smaller broken down skills were less than the skill required to do an entire production. So that move towards unskilled labor may have reduced the need to train people as apprentices, because apprentices were learning to become skilled craftsmen. So this paper tries to extend our knowledge base in terms of defining the timing of the decline, and having figured out when it declined, try to say something about what factors seem consistent with the decline, and hence might explain it. The reason we can make some progress on these questions is because of the superior data available in Quebec. So instead of this relatively small data set used in the first paper, this one extends the data set to almost 2,800 contracts over a 50-year period, so a longer period from 1791 to 1842. The contracts are, again, all from Montreal and involve crafts as before. This time they pick up the entire population of contracts that fulfill the criteria, being in a craft, not having any information missing, key information missing in the contracts, etc. So the first thing that happens in the paper is we have to figure out the actual timing of the decline, if it in fact occurred over this first half of the century. So to do that, I tried to figure out the stock of apprentice contracts. So this is like trying to figure out the population of apprentices. So I summed up the stock of contracts active in a given year. So in this example, I have three sort of contracts, 1, 2, and 3. And the first one runs from 1800 through to 1803. The second one is a 3-year contract beginning in 1801, and the third one starts in 1802 and goes to 1805. So there's 3 boys working in these contracts at these different times. So I sum up all the contracts active in a given year. So there's 1 in 1800, 2 in 1801, 3 in 1802, etc. And that gives us sort of the population of contracts that are active in a given year. Okay. I separate it out by partnered versus non-partnered masters. This is looking at trying to identify larger operations. If you think of the Golden and Sokolov hypothesis, it's really a move to a larger scale production where they're de-skilling the process of manufacturing. It's not likely to be observed in small master and apprentice, tiny operations. So we use partnered as a proxy for larger operations. A partnered master is one that where two masters are listed in the contract, or Smith and Son, or Smith and Smith. Okay, so we're going to be able to see what happens to the stock of contracts by a proxy for larger operations versus smaller, and I'll also divide the stock by the measure of the population, so we can see whether the number of apprentices employed in the city of Montreal is changing as a fraction of the population. Okay, so this figure shows us the results of that exercise. We see total apprentice stock on the y-axis, the first y-axis, and that's what this pink line measures, the total apprentice stock, just the sum of all active contracts. I've just cut off the first few years because they wouldn't represent the total. But from 1798 through to 1840, we can see that there's a substantial increase until about 1815 or so, when it becomes relatively flat and exhibits a negative trend thereafter. If we take account of population growth, we actually see that the stock as a fraction of the population declines markedly between about 1810 and 1825. And there I don't have population measured every single year, but we know there's a substantial decline in the use of apprenticeship in this quite early era, the 1810s. Well, we haven't studied the Golden and Sokolov paper yet. Most of the increase in sort of size of shops, scale of manufacturing that they talk about is a phenomenon that's coming later, maybe the 1830s, 40s at the earliest. Okay. The third line that you see here is this apprentice stock among partnered shops, and this is the axis that's relevant for that is on this other secondary y-axis. So the numbers are much smaller. There aren't as many of them, but we can see that the stock of boys in apprentice contracts hired by partnered masters is growing throughout this period, but we see two sharp declines, one in the kind of late 1820s, and then from about the mid-1830s on, it's declining quite sharply. So that really tells us something about the timing of the decline. First, that we've actually picked it up, and that it seems to be starting in the kind of 18 teens. So any explanation for the decline that we find has to sort of explain why we would see this pulling back from apprenticeship long before we anticipate seeing a rise of larger shops in a de-skilled process. We can dive a little deeper into looking at what the principal causes of the stock decline were. Just mechanically, that stock is going to decline either because the number of masters declines, so maybe a trade is just shrinking. It could be that the share of masters hiring apprentices under contract declines, or it could be that the number of apprentices a master employed declines. So I hire apprentices by contract, but instead of hiring 5, I hire 2. Okay. To figure out which of these possibilities actually occurred and help us understand the decline, I have to somehow link the apprentice contracts to a larger sort of stock of or population of masters in the city. And we don't have excellent evidence or information on the full population of master craftsmen in the various trades, except there are 2 city directories over this period that we can rely on. The city directories are a bit like phone books without phones. They list all the, for example, brewers and distillers operating in the city. I know this is a little bit hard to read, but this says George Bourne and Company, so this would be a partnered master. Brewers, and they're on 53 St. Paul Street. William Dow and Company is also a partnered master. It's brewer and distillery, and that tells you where it is on St. Joseph Street. And we also see a kind of a more perhaps recognizable brewer, Molson. I think it's Thomas and William, the brothers, that were operating already in the, I think this is from the 1819. So that's kind of interesting. And this would give us then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 brewers and distillers operating in the city at a particular point in time. And then we're going to kind of link it to the contracts. Do I see any contracts with a master named George Bourne or not? So what fraction of these brewers hired apprentices under contract? And how did that change? Okay, so we have 2 directories, 1819 and 1843. We have listed here, I just looked at this, made this link for this particular set of occupations. And I can see, for example, for all of these occupations, which are common in my apprentice database, there are 556 masters or craftsmen, at least, or people purporting themselves to be shoemakers or coopers in the directory in 1819, and I can link them to 27% of the masters in my database of apprentice contracts. So 27% of the masters in Montreal in 1819 were signing apprentices under contract. And if we look to 1843, there are a lot more masters, okay, and like almost, well, not quite 2,000, but a lot more, and only 15% of these masters are signing apprentices under contract that I can find and link in my database. So the number of masters rises. The number of masters, even in per capita terms, is going up. But sorry, but the this fraction of masters hiring um, hiring apprentices is declining. Okay, so moving on, we separate this into partnered and non-partnered as well, and we can see that for the partnered masters, there aren't that many of them in the directory under these trades, okay? Just 27, and 2/3 of them are hiring apprentices under contract um, in my database, and um, then in the 1843 period, we find more partnered masters, but the share of these masters hiring apprentices under contract declines again. We can see this decline is roughly similar in terms of magnitudes for partnered and non-partnered masters. We can see obviously a lot more of these small, or I mean they are smaller, but anyway, a lot more non-partnered masters, and also this decline in the rate at which they were hiring apprentices under contract. The third thing you want to notice is that the chance that a partnered master is hiring an apprentice is much higher than the incidence of hiring apprentices amongst non-partnered masters. That's true in both the early period, 1819 and 1843. And that sort of makes sense in that we would anticipate that these bigger masters who are hiring more people are more likely to be found in the apprentice contract database. Okay, so we can see that the number of masters is increasing relative to the population, so that's not the reason for the decline. We can also see that the percent of masters hiring apprentices is declining. And if we look across trades, we can see that is quite widespread. The decline is happening in almost every trade, with the exception of some of the leather trades, the shoemakers. We see an increase, saddlers and tanners, but pretty well everything else across the board is exhibiting declines. So that tells us something, well, hopefully useful about the decline in the stock that we observe, that it's some kind of widespread phenomenon. It's probably not just specific to some kind of a technological change in a couple of industries, but it's something happening fairly across the board as masters are getting their employees in some other way or changing something. Okay? If we think about the timing of the initial decline around the 1810s, that does seem, as I said before, pretty early for the Golden and Sokoloff sort of de-skilling hypothesis. That would line up better with sort of 1830s-ish, 1820s to 40s. If we can start looking for clues as to what was going on, or whether we can see any evidence that's sort of consistent with Golden and Sokoloff's hypothesis by looking at some of the aspects or characteristics of the database. So this table is telling us a couple of things that we might expect if we're looking for evidence of a Golden and Sokoloff large shop phenomenon. so this is looking at the incidence of partnered masters. So there's sort of 10% of masters are in partnerships in the early 1800s, and that's rising to 16% in the 1830s. And we see it sort of kind of a little bit static at the beginning there, and then growing, but not really growing at some tremendously huge rate. But we are picking up this increase in partnership. Okay, this variable is called NA year hire. This is the number of active contracts an individual master had in a given year. The minimum is sort of 1, which would be the number of apprentices a master if he just has the one person. But they could be hiring, more than one. So we can see here on average, this is among partnered masters. So we're just looking at the bigger shops and trying to see evidence of, did these big shops grow in terms of the numbers of people they hired? And if so, when did that happen? So we see on average among the partnered shops, they're hiring, or they have under contract at a given point in time, like 3 boys on average. Okay, this is sort of through the first part of this period. And then in the 1820s, we see this increase. On average, they're over 4. And then it goes up a lot. In the 30s, we have 8 on average, which is quite a large number of boys. And almost 5 again in the 30s. So we see this sort of tremendous growth occurring in size of operations. This is sort of like a tip of the iceberg thing. Obviously, they're hiring more people than just these boys under contract. But at a minimum, we can see they're hiring at least this many, and we can see this growth that's occurring, kind of in line with the timing of the Golden Sokolov hypothesis, the 20s, 30s, but not in line with the initial timing of the decline of apprenticeship. Okay. Again, one other attribute that might be sort of correlated with or evidence for growth in the size of operations that we would think is consistent with a Golden and Sokolov notion is the share of boys that a master was able to house. Traditionally, a master would keep the boy in his house, okay, give him a room and board. But in this case, we see that, okay, so this is looking at the incidence of no room and board. So this is the chances that a contract among partnered masters is not providing room and board. And we can see initially there's there's no contract that doesn't give the boys room and board. And then it's 6%, 12%, 18%. So it's moving up. But then we see really tremendous growth. A third of these contracts don't, and then over half do not house the boys in the 30s. Okay, so in terms of evidence of these bigger shops, sorry, this is happening in the 1830s. Okay, and most importantly, then, the timing of big shops that we would expect to have an impact on the hiring of apprentices appears to happen later, but not when apprenticeship first declined, at least in Montreal. Okay. So we look next to some of the attributes of the contracts to try to give us some sense of why apprenticeship first begins to decline in the 1810s. The terms of contracts reveal several important clues. One is that the duration of the contracts fall. This is, if we see around 1815, the average duration of apprenticeship drops from something like 5.5 years. Right? We see sort of pretty consistently through the first periods around 5.5 years. Then it starts declining quite markedly through the teens, and then kind of settles around 4.5 to 5 years, depending on what timing we're looking at. Okay. Tenure is telling you how much time is actually served, because some of the contracts were annulled, meaning they ended early. They would go back and write on the contract that they were ending it. So that's a tenure showing the same sort of pattern, that very static, flat average duration of contract till around 1812, and then it starts declining steadily through to the mid-1820s, and that is moving as you see here. Okay, the other feature that's moving at the same time is age. So often they're signing on and let's say at age 15 and agreeing to work until they hit the age of 21, which is the age of majority, and they become an adult under the eyes of the law. And so it's not surprising that we see as durations declining, age, the average age at which boys are starting their apprenticeships is increasing. Okay, so maybe they're 14 and a half or so on average, but then suddenly prior to 1815 and then around 1815 we see this steady marked increase in the age at which boys are beginning their apprenticeship. So that's an interesting thing to think about in terms of what might be going on. Why are the apprentices older? Are the boys just delaying the time at which they're willing to begin a contract, or are masters preferring older boys? And one other feature we'd want to answer in this is the amount of training declining. As we see the duration decline, are boys actually learning less? So is the nature of apprenticeship changing? One way to answer that last question is the kind of amount of actual training declining, is to look at the duration controlling for age. Okay, so for a given age, okay, does the duration of contract or duration of apprenticeship decline or change? So to do this a bit more carefully than just plotting that in raw levels, I run a regression. This isn't in the paper, but just added it here, where I'm just showing you the kind of the coefficients from these year dummy grouped year dummy effects. So we're just seeing kind of the trend in duration, okay, controlling for apprentice characteristics and master characteristics. So whether they could sign their name, what kind of trade they're in, whether the master's partnered. So a whole set of characteristics. So when you're controlling for them, you're saying sort of, for a given trade, for given master characteristics, whether they could sign their name, French or English, etc. Okay, and then run this for actually a given age, and then just plot out these these year coefficients. Okay, so relative to the earlier period, we see that that the age is okay, sorry, so let me say this again. So this is, the red one is for the 15-year-olds, okay? And all of these coefficients are actually insignificant. Only when I circle them are they statistically significant, meaning they're different from 0, okay? And this is really saying then that as the age moved up, the starting age and the duration decline, we're seeing that sort of duration of the apprentice contract wasn't meaningfully changing. So for 15-year-olds, they're serving roughly the same time, even as this change is taking place. Okay. But then we see this decline significantly in the 1830s, meaning they're getting less, shorter durations, significantly shorter durations among 15-year-olds. And this is for 16-year-olds. We can see that they're really not serving any kind of different length in terms of contract throughout this entire period until we get to the very end, when we see they're serving sort of statistically significantly less, in the order of about a third of a year less. So it's sort of not until this latter period where we see, this is for more ages, 13, 14, and 17, where we sort of see consistently that the actual amount of training controlling for age is declining, and with the exception of, I think this is 14-year-olds, we really don't see that the total amount of training given age is declining. So this is strikes me as sort of suggestive of the fact that, consistent with Golden and Sokolov, once you move to larger scale operations in the 1830s and you de-skill the processes, you really don't need to train as much. But prior to that, we're not seeing that actual training is declining. We're just seeing this move towards older boys, and older boys serve less time. So it's just more of a one-to-one change, just a year older and a year less time, for example. But in the 1830s, it might be a year older and a year and a half less time. So a real decline in amount of training. Okay. And this just shows sort of this distribution of ages. This wage is workers' age, or sort of the apprentice's age. We can see this distribution of ages really kind of moving to the right in the 1830s, and in the earlier periods, it's just kind of over here, this sort of distribution of ages of the apprentices around 15, but then this is really sort of shifting right by the latter period as we move towards older boys. Okay, so the next thing we'll look at here is pay. Okay, so this is looking at the total amount of pay of that boys receive. So this is just sort of looking at your cash. And the reason I was interested in looking at pay is I was trying to think about what's going on in terms of sort of supply or demand. So thinking about the market for apprentices, we're seeing the amount of apprenticeships decline, and it could be driven by supply. So boys just not choosing apprenticeships or not beginning them until later, or it could be a change in the demand, sort of from the master side, that they don't want to hire boys. Okay, so that I think this might be on the next slide, or maybe a couple more. Sorry. So this is saying, if we think about the fact that the amount of apprenticeships declines, so this is clear, L is going down, the amount of boys hired as apprentices decline. If it's a supply-driven feature or cause, then we would expect to see boys' pay go up. Okay, that if it's a demand-driven, masters-driven change that's driving down the number of boys hired, then we would expect to see their pay decline. Okay, so let's go back up a bit. That's why I started to look at their compensation. So this clearly doesn't have all the boys in it because not all of them are receiving cash, but for boys that do receive cash, we want to look at what happens to their pay. Okay. Okay, so this is, again, instead of sort of just looking at the raw sort of amount of pay, it tries to look at it in a regression format, which or context, where we're just reporting the year dummy variables for sort of these are older boys and younger boys. Right, this is sort of interacted with age. Where this sort of age, where I'm just looking at separating out younger boys under 15 and one's over 15. And instead of just looking at what happens to their pay over time, okay, it tries to control for trades, because some change in pay might be happening because the composition of trades change, maybe towards higher paying trades. But by controlling for trades in the regression, you're saying basically, you're taking that away as a possibility. So it's sort of controlling for trades, or for a given trade, what's on average happening to pay. Total pay could also be driven by changes in apprentice characteristics. The more skilled, more literate, older, something, all those things can be driving pay. Masters as well. So a control for apprentice attributes, master attributes, the trades, and look at what happened to pay over time, on average, and just separate it by younger and older boys. And we can see that their pay is, this is their total compensation over their total cash compensation over the life of their contract, is going up through this period till about 1815 or so. And then it's fairly static for the older boys, okay? But then rising really markedly in the late 30s. Total pay for the younger boys is declining through from the point at which pay or apprenticeship first declines in the teens, we see this sort of compensation declining for younger boys. Okay, and this one, which is obviously not very visible here, this is pay per year. It sort of separates the total pay into its components. The total pay was on the previous slide, but that total compensation can be pay per year on average, okay, V over T, the term length, or it could be changes in T, so it's just T times V over T. So just separated it into those two components, and this are pay per year, and there's duration, and this is I think duration for I believe this is for the younger boys. What this is showing is the wage of the older boys rising. This is the red one, okay? This is the point at which we see the decline first happening. And we can see it sort of all looks kind of similar before that, before the sort of 1815. I'll redo this slide. But then you see this sort of movement of, you see a real decline in duration, the duration of apprenticeships among the younger boys, right? And pay rising effectively among the older boys. Okay, that's the red one. Okay, so if we think about this market for a child labor model, it's suggestive or consistent with in the 1830s. Among older boys, we see an increase in wage, okay, and fewer boys, which is suggestive of a supply shock. And in the sort of 1810s, more among younger boys, we see sort of fewer boys, so again a decline in the number, and no real wage per year change, okay, but sort of the total value of the contracts is falling. So it's a little bit more suggestive of dominant demand shock. So suggesting in the teens, masters are kind of moving away from hiring younger boys. They're preferring older boys and switching out and not looking at the younger boys and hiring older boys. And so that's why we see this move towards older boys. And then not until the 1830s do we see this sort of evidence of children, these older boys, reducing their supply in the apprentice market. So they're walking away. They're choosing not to be hired in the apprentice market, and that's not surprising in that as we learn from people like Golden and Sokoloff, these larger shops that are just hiring a lot of unskilled labor were paying well. So these boys could have just been competed away by these sort of bigger firms just hiring unskilled labor. Okay. It still leaves us with a bit of a puzzle of what exactly is going on in the teens at the timing of the initial decline in apprenticeship. What was really driving masters to choose older boys? We can look to some of the characteristics of compensation to gain some clues about why masters would be choosing older boys at this time and dropping younger boys. One of the really fascinating things that happened in the contracts is we see a real substantive change in the way in which children were compensated. So this table shows us for 4 different periods how sort of average compensation in each year of a 5-year contract. So it's just looking at for 5-year terms only for contracts with cash compensation. We can see in the initial period, okay, before 1800 essentially, on average, the pay is very flat, okay? If we look to the latter period all the way through to the 1830s, we can see that pay over the course of a 5-year contract shows a much higher gradient. Okay? It's increasing a lot. Okay? And we see it's still is quite flat in this period here in the early 1800s, but then it's increasing. You know, it's just a sort of a continuous path of increasing pay. And we can also see, if we look at the pay in the first year, that first year pay actually declines. Okay? And we can figure out sort of what's going on and when these changes occurred. So essentially, if you think about the early period, the traditional period, boys are kind of receive the same compensation throughout their term, whether or not they receive cash. Mostly they're receiving pay in kind, but if it's said cash, they would explicitly say the same amount every single year. We know that their expected productivity is rising over their contract. Right? They don't know anything at the beginning. They know a lot at the end. So we know there's this substantial gap, one would expect anyway. This is their expected value of marginal product here, their expected value of productivity. So we expect these are fairly far apart. And these sort of, this gap, as we talked about last time, would lead to some potential and enforcement issues. That enforcement of these contracts is important. You can only write a contract with really flat compensation if you're sure for other reasons that the boy isn't going to run away as soon as it becomes kind of in his interest, or seemingly in his interest, to run away. So once he could receive more outside in another job, you would think he would want to leave. And we know the law said you couldn't leave, but still you would think maybe they would run away. And as talked about elsewhere, there are lots of ways of trying to enforce these contracts to make sure they kind of worked. But they really had to use these sort of other means of making the contracts enforceable, relying on parents almost acting as collateral, using big deferred payments at the end, etc. Making sure they knew each other. Okay, so in terms of the last slide, when we see this compensation changing, what we're really seeing is sort of something like this, like it's moving the pay. This is sort of showing you the change in the gradient of the pay is moving closer, or what we would anticipate is closer to the path of the expected productivity. Okay, so that's really kind of interesting to me anyway, which it's suggesting that it would be reducing the problems of the potential problems in enforceability. Once you pay them more closely on the path of their expected productivity, less initially and more later on, then it's just not as costly if the contract isn't completed. So if at any point they decide they don't want to work together, the master is not losing a whole lot of investment that he would have otherwise, and the apprentice is also, depending on the timing, isn't losing or isn't gaining markedly by leaving early. Okay, so it seems like at least one consequence of changing the nature of pay is that it changes the nature of enforceability of these contracts. So perhaps that was a reason for making that move. Okay. We can look explicitly at the timing of this change. I showed you that the 30s look very different from the early period in terms of this trajectory, okay, of the wage compensation each year. But we can look at sort of the average pay compared to the first year pay. So let me just flip back a minute to tell you what I'm going to look at. I'm looking at the average, which let's say is represented by this, or whatever the average of this black line is, and the first year pay. And basically, if they're paid exactly the same every year, average and first year are going to line up on top of each other. They're going to be the same. But if they're paid less in the first year than they receive on average, we will see a gap. Okay, so this is showing us the average pay, V over T, is just the total compensation over the duration. So this red one, or the pink one, is the average, and this blue one is the first year pay. Okay, this is the raw numbers, and this is the same variables, but in a regression context where I've controlled for the apprentice attributes, the trades, the master's attributes, because perhaps that's driving some of what we see. So you can see really in either context the timing in terms of when we first see this move apart from the first year pay and average, and it's happening right around 1812. Okay, before they're kind of lining up pretty well on top of each other. Their pay is generally quite flat. Around 1812, they start paying them less initially and more over time, over the course of the contract. And we can see as you move along, in terms of years, that trajectory is clearly growing as the first year pay is increasingly different, okay, increasingly less than the average pay. So that trajectory in pay is much steeper in this sort of 1820s and 30s, but this split happens initially right at the time apprenticeship starts declining. So this is sort of suggesting that enforcement may have been an important consideration in the initial decline of apprenticeship, that we see this change in the nature of pay at that time. We see a move away from younger boys, and these are two really prominent features of the initial decline in apprenticeship. If we think about why that might be, well, there's a lot of change going on in Montreal at this time. 1812 to 15 is for the timing of the War of 1812, which is directly directly affected, or Montreal is directly affected by the War of 1812. So this, we also see just following the war around 1815, Montreal's population's changing markedly. Just post, as the war ends, the British immigrants are sort of flooding into the city. And if we think about the traditional apprenticeship, it relied markedly on kind of trust between the master and the apprentice's family, both to help kind of mitigate some of the uncertainty in the match and ensure that the contract would be honored. It relied on sort of parents running after the boys, relied on the two sides sort of knowing each other well. And once you have a lot more new immigrants into the city, and new immigrants of largely different ethnic group, I mean, there are plenty of English in Montreal before, but the composition is much more English after. You can't rely so much on trust and knowledge of the master-apprentice relationship if you don't know the boy or his family. So changing the nature of pay really reduced the need for outside measures of enforceability that relied on trust. Okay, we don't have to just look at this one measure to say that seems to be the case. We can look at other aspects of the contracts, other clauses in the contract, and see how they changed. We can see that the fact that the contracts were sort of pretty much stopped, including clauses that said the parents would run after the apprentice if the apprentice ran away. That was very common in the 1790s and early 1800s. Okay, but then you'd see this giant break where it's almost quite rare to see that kind of clause. Instead, they would have a more explicit liability, like a financial. You'll have to pay damages if your child does not fulfill the terms of the contract. But we can also see that sort of in total, sponsor liability is declining. So they're relying less on the parents, the adult in the contract, on the worker side to enforce the contracts. We also see, sort of consistent with the idea that there was less informed pairings after 1815, in that the incidence of probations around, say, 35% prior to 1812, 1815. And then we see this incidence is higher, and that the duration of these probations is longer, which is suggestive of there being initially, anyway, prior to the probations, more uninformed matches in the latter period when the population of Montreal has grown. And we can see kind of the timing of these clauses if we look at it year on year. So this is the runaway clause, really starts declining, or certainly declines precipitously in the teens. Okay? And this move towards explicit liability. So you have to pay damages instead of, oh, I think you might run away, or I think you might run after your child and bring them back. So more of just a strict financial arrangement. So all of that's sort of happening in here. And the incidence of probation also seems to break around the teens. So we see this, it's bouncing around, but fairly static. And then it's first increases steadily after about 18, 15. Okay, so we see this apprenticeship, declining around initially around the 18 teens. Why that happened, I'm arguing there's evidence that's consistent with kind of a post-war flood of new British immigrants that sort of lowered the quality of pre-hire information, and we consequently seeing masters opting for less risky contracts. They don't want to hire young boys. Those are riskier hires. They're long durations, greater uncertainty in evaluating those boys, and they reduce the use of a mechanism that caused them to where they had to rely on mutual trust. Those changes all precede signs of the rise of larger shops. That de-skilling of the workforce into factory-like organizations, that's kind of the Golden and Sokoloff hypotheses. It's not to say that that isn't ultimately very important for explaining the decline of apprenticeship. Clearly it was. But I really think it's interesting that so much change precedes that transformation, and that we really see a substantive move away from apprenticeship that has absolutely nothing to do with the rise of larger shops. And who knows, may have actually precipitated some of the move towards larger shops, that perhaps masters thought it would be better to move towards a de-skilled process because the populations were becoming larger, less well known, and unable to rely on these long trust relationships, trust heavy. Okay, so that explains or at least some hypotheses about and some evidence about the decline of apprenticeship.